Do you think it's too late to stop climate change?
Of course it's too late, but the question is, what do we do?
Controversial subjects with the facts can be tense, but we are a sub-science here to make things make sense.
Mr. David Suzuki, we are huge fans and honored to have you here. But for those listening who might not know who you are, if you could give a brief introduction, we'd appreciate that.
Well, I'm an old man. I'm a grandfather of 10 great, wonderful grandchildren, and I'm a retired professor at the University of British Columbia. I'm a geneticist, and I hosted The Nature of Things for 44 years.
And that's basically what we grew up knowing you as. Something interesting for me, listening to you in recent interviews, we were kind of in the news. You've been an environmentalist for many decades. And I kind of wanted to start this interview right off the bat, kind of touching on what was in some of those interviews and asking, do you think it's too late to stop climate change?
Oh, it's already happening now. The only thing that we've been fighting against was the question of how much were we going to tolerate. And in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a very surprising report called a special report. Now remember, the IPCC, which is the most authoritative organization of climatologists around the world, comes out with a report every 5 years. But because it's an intergovernmental panel on climate, every single report is vetted by every country, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the US. So they're always very cautious and conservative in their predictions for the next 5 years. And every 5-year report has fallen way below what actually happened. So it was really shocking when they came out with a special report that said, look, we must not allow temperature to rise above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that was at that time looking at 2100. And they said, this is a critical point. After 1.5 degree rise, we can't predict what's going to happen, but it's going to be climate chaos. So and that was the level that was set by the Paris conference in 2015. They said, keep temperature from rising above 1.5 to 2 degrees by 2100. That was the target that everyone signed on to. But then in 2018, the IPCC said, no, don't look at 2 degrees. 1.5 degrees got to be the limit. We passed 1.5 degrees in 2025. And there's no sign at all that we're reducing. This year is going to be the record year of carbon emissions. So what the hell? There's going to be the 30th COP meeting on climate in Belém, Brazil next week. Is it next week?
Tomorrow.
After
tomorrow.
After 29 meetings, are we not ready to say, hey, it doesn't work? We haven't even been able to cap emissions, let alone reduce it down below, who knows? So your question was, is it too late? Of course it's too late. But the question is, what do we do? People are saying, well, every 0.1 degree matters, so we got to keep working. But wait a minute now. We've had 29 COP meetings trying to limit it. At what point do you say, it ain't working? It doesn't work that way. So we got to admit that. The best environment minister we've ever had was Stephen Guilbeault. I knew Stephen from way back in the 1990s. We were at the Kyoto conference in 1997 together, and we were supporting the same things. He was with Greenpeace. He became environment minister. After 2 years, I emailed him and I said, look, you got to resign. I said, you're a great environment minister, but you can't even tell us the truth. You can't tell us how bad it is. You can't tell us that most of the oil that we know, where we know it's in the ground, has to be left in the ground. Have you ever heard a politician ever say that? No. So politics constrained you. I said, you've got to resign and then tell everybody why you resigned. Well, he didn't resign, but and he he did the best he could, but we're still not operating as if it's an emergency. We're in an emergency now. And that's why I supported Seth Klein. Do you know Seth Klein? His book, A Good War?
No.
Oh, everybody should know that. So in 1940, when we went to war, we had to go to war because we were part of the British Commonwealth. And so when England got into the war, we had to join. So when we joined the war, Canada was a rinky-dink country of 11 million people. 1 million Canadians signed up to put their lives on the line and go to war. Can you imagine? Almost 10% of Canadians signed up to go to war. And then, there were a few months when Canadians sat around going, well, we're at war, but what do we do? Once they decided this is an emergency, we've got to be involved, we've got to win this war, Canada set up 26 crown corporations to do the things that the private sector wasn't doing. And then they hired people, executives from the private sector, for $1 a year to run the crown corporation. They set a limit on how much profit you can make during the war. They said, you shouldn't be making windfall profits just because you're pumping out guns or tanks or planes. What Canada did in 1940, when we went to war, Canada was making 40 airplanes a year. By the end of the war, we were employing 150,000 people in the aviation industry. We were the fourth largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. And a lot of those people working in the aviation industry were women, because the men were at war, women were working. The record of what Canada did during World War II is astounding. And that's what we need to confront the climate crisis. If we declare it an emergency, and we did in a small way with COVID. When COVID happened, this government suddenly spent $300 billion. Where the hell did that money come from? Nobody was saying this is going to break the bank, we can't afford it. We did it because we had an emergency and we had to deal with it. And that's what we need with the climate issue.
That's so fascinating. I was reading about COP30, which starts tomorrow, and the UN head guy named Guterres said that he's now calling it a war on nature is what is happening right now, which I found that language kind of interesting. But you also are so able to speak so openly about capitalism being the issue in all of this. Is capitalism the reason for climate change in your opinion, and how do we talk about that?
Well, climate change is natural, right? It happens depending on how much light is actually, or heat is kept on the planet. Climate change has allowed life to evolve, because it kind of steadied off the temperature from day to night through the season. So climate change is, as the anti-climate people say, it's natural, it's true. What's unnatural is that there is a balance between the greenhouse gases that are emitted by nature and how much is taken back out. There's been a fine balance, and we've benefited from that enormously. But now that we're using such a massive amount of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are wonderful. You can pack a huge amount of energy into a small space, so they're really great. But we're now producing so much fossil fuel that the environment can't absorb it fast enough, and it's accumulating. So we've known that. The fossil fuel industry has known that since 1959. If you look at Jeff Dembicki's book, Petroleum Papers, he points out that in 1959, the API, the American Petroleum Institute, which is an organization of all of the big fossil fuel industries, they were told by Edward Teller. We call Edward Teller the father of the hydrogen bomb, but he was an eminent physicist. And in 1959, he told the API that burning their product is accumulating greenhouse gases and will warm the planet. By the 1970s, I think it was James Black, who was the lead scientist for Exxon,
Yeah.
told people he was right. Edward Teller was right. Burning our product is accumulating and it's going to warm the planet. So the industry has known, and that's why by the 1980s, climate change, we called it global warming back then, had become a major issue. But then what we saw was the fossil fuel industry ramped up its PR. They hired many of the people that worked on the tobacco industry response to the Surgeon General's report that smoking causes cancer. The cigarette tobacco industry fought back tremendously on that. And then people learned from that how you effectively affect public relations, and they went into the fossil fuel industry, which has spent tens of billions of dollars telling us, no, the climatologists don't know, blah, all that stuff. And it worked.
Yeah, I'm going to ask, like, despite then not only the industry knowing that climate change has been happening for decades, and now despite, many average people understanding this has happened, and despite, like you said, there being access to funds when the government wants to pull them for emergencies, where does that leave not only the environmental movement, but individuals who often feel hopeless? Like, a lot of our listeners are younger people who are hearing things like this. Hey, we haven't been able to hit any of these targets. The strategy is obviously we're up against these billion or trillion dollar corporations that are fighting against this. Where do we go? How do we actually have an impact as individuals? And how do we restructure this environmental movement to have success?
Well, at some point you have to say our tactics haven't worked. By the way, why am I wearing these headphones?
It is so that our audio doesn't come back through your computer.
Because
so
I don't like using them. if I could do it, wait, that okay?
Sure, yeah, we can.
But can you hear us?
Oh, I see. No, I can't hear you. Got me.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. They are.
Yeah,
we've got the little ones.
We have ours here.
Yeah, I see that. Okay. Well, I think we have to admit, when I gave the iPolitics interview and said it's too late, I was saying that by going by what the science has told us. The science has clearly been in for a long time, but I really take Johan Rockström's work as the rock solid indicator of how we stand on the planet. Do you know Johan Rockström's work?
No, not enough to.
Well,
I'd love to hear you explain it or talk about it.
Your guys are a science program. You ought to know that. Johan Rockström, he's a Swedish scientist, but he's the head of the Potsdam Institute in Berlin. And they have 150 PhDs working. I mean, it's really a big firm. And he, over 10 years ago, his group began to say, look, there are boundaries within which we as a species, as an animal, we have to live within those boundaries. If we exceed those boundaries, then the natural world is destabilized, and we can't assume that we can live in any sustainable way. So I don't know if I can remember all of the boundaries. The carbon in the atmosphere, the pH in the oceans. The pH is dropping because carbon dioxide is accumulating, dissolves in the oceans as carbonic acid. So we're acidifying the oceans through our excess. The ozone layer, aerosol impact on the atmosphere, the nitrogen cycle, fresh water availability. So there are these 9 critical boundaries that when we pass those boundaries, it destabilizes everything. Only 2 of the 9 boundaries are we in what he calls the safe zone. That's aerosol loading and the ozone layer. The ozone layer is an example of what can happen when the world treats it in a serious way. But in 7 of the 9 boundaries, we are already past the danger zone. We're into, well, basically free fall. Now, Rockstrom claims, I don't believe him, but he says if we can pull back out of the danger zone from those 7 areas, we can get back to a more predictable world. Well, if you look at what we've done with climate change for 30 meetings, I'd say the chances of pulling back in all 7 of these areas in 5 years, forget it. You know, like that's the reality, what history tells you. And so from my standpoint, you know, people say, well, where's your hope? Well, if your hope is, oh, don't worry, it'll work out. That's not hope. That's hopium. You just want to shoot it up and go, don't worry. No, hope without action is not hope.
Yeah.
You've got to have action, because the action says, I believe a different outcome is possible. Otherwise, why would you do it? So action, if you want hope, it's got to be coupled with action. And I know young people are feeling very discouraged. When I first met Greta, the first thing I did was to say, I am so sorry. This should not be your job. Your job as a young person is to meet new people and, you know, get crushes on people and explore the world of poetry and history, and like that's your job. And mom and dad should be warriors. Now, I know Greta's parents are very supportive of her, but to the average child today who's freaked out, the first thing I say is, if mom and dad aren't warriors at the barracks for you, then it is a pretty hopeless situation. The hope for young people has got to be their parents. If parents love you, then they've got to be warriors.
I think that's an incredible point. We've talked about that a lot. I've heard you say that before. So many people our age and older having kids say this. It is such a taxing thing to say, oh, the young people, I'm so excited for them. They're going to figure it out. Putting this responsibility on young people, like that's such a brilliant way to put it. No, they are supposed to be free to think about other things. That's the point of youth. It's a really powerful thing, because I think I'm going to start catching that more as adults say it.
Yeah, and a lot of people, like our friends or people our age or younger, ask the question, is it even ethical at this stage to have children? Should I not? But it's an interesting perspective to think like, okay, you as a parent can be that leader. Like if that is your concern and you have children, can you represent that force in the world to show them how to take action, how to not only care about something, but turn it into accountability. And yeah, it's like an amazing way to think about it, that we shouldn't just be hoping for the children to solve the issue.
Yeah, exactly. When Severn, my daughter, gave a speech at Rio when she was 12, adults were saying, oh, we've done a terrible job, but you kids are going to be different. She said, what the hell? You're our role model. If you aren't acting right, why do you think we're going to be any different? Mm-hmm. And then she said, is saying we're the hope an excuse for you not to do anything? I thought, wow, that kid, he's smart.
She must have had a good role model.
When people like you go through university, get your education, you get a job, you find a partner, you buy a house, and then environmentalists come along and say, you got to change. They don't say, oh, you're right. They get pissed off. They've invested a lot of time to get their education and get a job and have an income and buy a house. And then to be told you got to change. And that's what I found. And we started our organization in 1990 because the World Watch Institute had said this has to be the turnaround decade. We've got 10 years to change direction. So we began the foundation and said, every dollar we raise, we got to spend it. We can't save any. We've got 10 years. And people started to tell us, oh, you got to get into the schools. I said, we don't have time for this, for the kids to grow up and replace us. We've only got 10 years. Big mistake. What I just told you we found is adults don't like to be told to change, but they love their children. And I realized later that, oh my God, the children are the avenue into the parents. If if parents aren't willing to do anything to save their children, what kind of a species are we? You know,
It makes me think of like, so through doing our science communication online, the climate crisis, we have taken angles to explain exactly what you said earlier about like ExxonMobil essentially discovering greenhouse gas emissions, like painting oil companies as evil, like trying to figure out these narratives to get people on board. Again, not to put words in your mouth, but we've also felt like we're failing at doing this. We've tried so many different strategies. I had a professor on the podcast recently, Dr. Shelby Riskin, who was a part of a really beautiful wetland project in Toronto, this huge expansion of a park. It's such a positive, beautiful thing to see happen. And I brought this up with her, and she says that sometimes talking about the oil companies she thinks is too big. She thinks it's intimidating to people. Kind of was a light bulb moment for me of like, okay, wow, maybe when I'm yelling about that, I'm going too large. I was just curious if you agree with that, if you think that there are more tangible things for adults to be thinking about in regards to how to have action. Because sometimes I yell about the fossil fuel industry can be the cigarette company, the easy, angry thing, but then it does leave you a little helpless. I was just curious if you felt
well,
anything
I don't.
about that.
The fossil fuel executives are doing what they're meant to do in the capitalist system. That is to make money. The more you make, the better it is. The faster you make it, the better it is. And there's no reciprocity. There's no responsibility. The thing that, you know, I've learned so much from working with Indigenous people. They're constantly acknowledging that nature is giving them everything they need to live well, and they thank their creator for that. But there's always reciprocity. They always promise, we will act in a good way to ensure that you can continue to be as generous and abundant as you are. We don't have all this freedom bullshit, you know, like this is one of the problems. There's no reciprocity in the free enterprise system. It's just, we got to make money. And, you know, they're saying, get government off our backs. Don't pass all these laws. Trust us. But so they don't want government intervention. And yet they will take all kinds of money from government. The hypocrisy in that, you know, like keep government off our backs, but we'll take the money that you're willing to subsidize us with. It's horrifying. But the CEOs of these companies, their job is to make money. The more, the faster, without any reciprocity. Now, Partha Dasgupta, an economist in Britain, published, it's like a 600-page tome 2 or 3 years ago now. You can look it up in Google. And what he shows is that the economic system that we're now bought into is, it acknowledges or is based on human creativity and human productivity. So the more efficient you are in producing products and the more imaginative, this is why all these guys like Musk and Bezos and are having a heyday. They get an idea and look at the money they can make. And there's no reciprocity. What is the problem, according to Partha Dasgupta? Nature, the air, the water, the soil, the biodiversity that allows us to live is not in the economic system. It's all based on us. We're so smart. We're so productive that's what the economy is based on. So if you look at Mark Carney's book, Values, in the first chapter, there it is. Amazon, Jeff Bezos' company, is valued by the economy in the tens of billions of dollars. Amazon, the rainforest, the greatest terrestrial ecosystem on the planet, has no economic value until it is logged, mined, dammed, or grows soybeans or cattle or houses. If that isn't a crazy system, and yet we had 10 years of a Harper government where he said, climate change, we can't do anything about that. That's crazy economics. So Harper elevated the economy above the very atmosphere that gives us air to breathe that gives us weather, climate, and the seasons, and the economy is more important? What the hell? There you have it. The system is rigged, and it applies not just to economics. Our legal system, our political systems, they're all built around us. Look, are you a Canadian outfit? Are you
Yeah,
guys?
we're Canadian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look at a map of Canada and look at the West Coast. Half of the British Columbia coast is this goddamn panhandle that comes down from Alaska. What the hell? You know, they're cutting off half of the coast, and then we try to manage. How do we manage salmon that are born in British Columbia but pass through the panhandle and then go up along the Alaskan coast? The Alaskans act as if they're their fish. Canadians act as if they're our fish. Those fish know where they belong and who they don't belong to us, but we try to manage them. How the hell do we do that with a panhandle coming down, taking half of our coastline? That's the one thing I agree with Donald Trump on, that our boundaries are artificial and they don't make any sense. They don't make any ecological sense. So our legal system, you know, where Canada's bragging now because Quebec got a declaration that the Magpie River has the rights of personhood. Now, there are a number of countries that have done that. Ecuador has done that. New Zealand has done that, given rivers the right to exist. Well, that all sounds great, but who the hell gave us the right to assign rights? You know, What about a mosquito? You know, what about a minnow? Do we not think they have the right to exist because they're here? They're here now by the very existence. We come along and say, "Oh, you're a pain in the ass." You know, we don't want mosquitoes. They spread disease to us.
I was going to go back to that idea of reciprocity, and I'm curious, like, where you found your connection to nature and how we can think about, especially as we live in like larger communities of people in larger cities that sometimes feel more disconnected. We're all connected through our phones, and a lot of people don't have access to nature in their backyard. I'm curious about your starting position with that, and if you have thoughts around, like, if this is at the core, if finding a way to connect people to nature to feel reciprocity when they give, where do we go with that?
Well, if you look in 1900, when the population of Canada was about 5.5 million, almost all people lived in small rural villages. We were still a farming animal in 1900 in this country. And if you look at the prairies, they were dotted with dozens of dots of villages. There were 150, 200 people, all connected by the railway so that they could grow cattle or grain, but ship them out to the urban centers by rail. But if we did a show on that years ago of a village that had once Springwater, it was called. It only had 2 families living there when we did the film, but it had once had 200 people. And they had a movie house, they had a butcher shop, they had a drugstore, they had groceries, they had everything that you need to. And the farmers would all come in on weekends, and that's when they would shop and they would, ship their grains, and they'd go to the movies and all that. They were that's how people live. When you are built still around agriculture, you know very well that nature is important. Weather, climate, the seasons, pollination, nitrogen fixation. These are all important things that farmers understand. But you come 100 years later, now they're, by the year 2000, I don't know what the population was, over 30 million. 85% of us are living in cities. Now, last week I did a program with school kids across the country, and the program was Get Outside or something. And it was all about why it's important for kids to go out in nature. But my message was, nature isn't out there. We think in a city, this is our habitat. We have nature out in parks or in reserves or in wild forests. But I tell the kids, okay, I want you all now to take a great big breath and hold it. And don't take another breath for 5 minutes. I'm going to keep talking, but you hold your breath for 5. And you know, kids are so trusting, right? They all go, and within 20 seconds, you can see they're turning pink. And by half a minute, they've all taken a breath. And I say, where do you think that air? We need air every minute of our lives. If you don't have air for 3 to 4 minutes, you're dead. If you have to breathe contaminated air, you're sick. Where do you think air is coming from? Is there some big factory that's filtering the air and making sure there's oxygen in it? No, it's nature that delivers. So we can't think nature is out there and I'm here separate from it. We are still embedded in it. I said, every one of you is 60 to 70% water. We're just a big blob of water with enough organic thickener added. We don't dribble away on the floor. But we leak water. It comes out of our skin and our mouth and our eyes and our crotch, and we lose water. If you don't have water for 4 to 6 days, you're dead. Drink polluted water, you're sick. Do you think the great thing is we get water in bottles, that we pay more for water in Canada than we pay for gasoline? And is that progress? Like, Canada has more fresh water per capita than any country in the world. And we think buying water in a bottle is a great success? What the hell? We haven't taken care of this great thing that we have in Canada. And look, over 100 Indigenous communities have lacked safe, fresh water, clean water for not months, but years. What kind of custodians are we? Where do we think water comes? Water is cartwheeling around the planet through the hydrologic cycle. In Vancouver, we get all of our fresh water from 3 watersheds surrounded by old-growth rainforest. When it rains, the tree roots and the other plant roots and the soil fungi and bacteria filter that water. We could go up to our reservoirs in Vancouver and just drink it. That's the way most of the fresh water in Canada was. As a boy, we'd go camping or canoeing and we'd drink water from any creek or any lake. Nobody worried about it. What have we done with this great gift from nature? Where is the reciprocity? Where do we ever thank water? Thank nature for giving us fresh water. And all of the food that we eat to build our bodies with, all of it was once living. We take the carcasses of plants and animals, tear them apart in our mouths, and then the debris of what's left, we make into our bodies. We are created by the animals and plants of the earth. And that comes, we've domesticated many of them, but ultimately they're a part of nature. And every bit of the energy that we need to play and move and jump, work, is sunlight, captured by plants and photosynthesis, converted into and stored in energetically active molecules. And then when we need that energy to do anything, we burn those molecules and liberate the energy of the sun back out. Who needs nature? We need nature because we are still utterly dependent on nature to create.
Function. Yeah, no matter if you think so or not, every single second of your day. Yeah.
That's my whole thing now is don't act as if nature's out there. It's around us and it's in us. And we've now got to be much more responsible for how we treat nature because nature is the source of our life and well-being.
Yeah, it makes me want to ask you 2 separate things. One about consumption and one about science communication. I'm going to start with consumption. So when I think everything you're saying, it's so beautiful, it's so brilliant, it's so tangible and real. And then sometimes what will happen is I'll go about my day and I'll see in my friends, in my life, online, on my phone, this constant pull towards consumption as personality. Like what you buy, what you're watching, what you're consuming, culture, even art, like these distractions that are really huge, especially like we're two gay guys. It's like, our pop girlies can take over a lot of our attention. And sometimes I wonder, like, is this actually part of the problem? Like, do you sometimes look at the way that we structure value around consumption and consumerism? I mean, you do. I've read your books, but it's just such a large pull that I start to see it everywhere. And I'm curious, in your own life, with your own friends, how do you talk about and combat that while maintaining this brilliant perspective on
first
nature?
of all, consumption is at the heart of our problem now. I mean, there are too many people. There are too many people to be sustained. Even if we lived at the level of Somalia or Bangladesh, there are too many people. The ecological footprint is just too great. But the other thing is that a small proportion of that population is consuming way beyond.
Yeah.
Well, and that's us in the industrialized world,
Canadians.
right? Yeah. So if you want, our population, you got to multiply that by consumption to get an idea of our ecological impact. And we are the overpopulated groups because of our consumption. But this was deliberately done. Remember, we went through a terrible time during the 1930s with the stock market crash in 1929, led to a Great Depression for the whole world. And that was a very, very tough time. My mother and father married right at the height of the Great Depression. And that influenced very much their way of thinking. They always said, you have to work hard for the money to buy the necessities in life. But you don't run after money as if having, a bigger car or a big house or fancy clothes means you're a better, more important person. Don't get caught up in that. Live within your means. Save some for tomorrow. Share. Don't be greedy. Those are all things that they kept pounding into our heads, my sisters and me, because they had been so heavily impacted by the Depression. What got us out of the Depression? War. Wars are great for getting the economy going. Even right now, look at Ukraine. Ukraine is developing a whole new industry of making drones. And, the war machine, man, it creates jobs and makes you money. So that cranked up then during World War II. And Roosevelt then said, oh my God, we're going to win this war. What do we do in peacetime? So he set up the Council of Economic Advisors to the president and said, how do we transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy? Now, he didn't live long enough to hear what they recommended, but the recommendation was consumption. We've got to make Americans worship at the altar of consumption. Buy stuff, use them up, throw them away, and buy more. And it worked. 70% of our economy now is based on consumption. How much of that is, my parents said, you need money for the necessities in life. How much of that of what we're purchasing is a necessity? God, I've only been to Walmart once, and I was shocked at all the stuff in there I didn't know I needed or wanted.
David Suzuki in Walmart is an epic. If anyone saw you, they were...
No, we were on a trip, and I was in Prince George and had to buy, I don't know whether it was a spare tire. We had a car emergency. But I couldn't believe, my God. And how much of that is I always, when I go to the supermarket to buy breakfast cereal for my grandchildren, oh my God, there must be 100 different products, from granola to stuff that's in little rings and strands and mats and different colors. None of it has anything to do with nutrition. The industry says we are competing for stomach space. We don't have an infinitely big stomach. So everybody is competing to get a part of that stomach space. And how do you do that? Fat, sugar, and salt. Just load it up and get it into those people. But none of it has got to do with nutrition. And it's the same thing with everything we do. What free enterprise does is once you establish a little niche, then everybody wants to jump in with a little variation. I remember one year they were advertising, here was an auto industry that had fought seat belts and fought airbags, just huge amounts of money fighting against them. Once the Congress forced seat belts and then airbags, then I saw an advertisement that said, we not only have airbags in the front, but we have them at the side and even in the back. And by us,
that even happens in food, where they say hormone free and it's regulated. You've only done it because you were forced.
Protein, now it's protein.
Now we're
even
selling,
thinking about consumption
get this car because it's got 6 cup holders instead of 2. What the hell? Whatever happened to the Beetle? The Beetle went unchanged for what? 20
I know,
years?
I haven't punch buggy beetled in so long.
What the hell? That's all we need.
I mean, it's interesting to have this conversation around how we consume so much when so many people in this exact day and age are saying they can afford less than ever. The affordability crisis is climbing. The wealth gap between rich and poor is growing larger and larger. But it's interesting to be we are conditioned to believe we need so much more. And the shows we watch and the holidays we celebrate, it's all about what are you getting? What are you buying? What are you... And so, I don't know, it's just interesting hearing you talk about how...
People say, oh, well, people are naturally greedy. They want stuff. We're just providing what people want. That's total bullshit. How much does the PR, the advertising industry... they spend over $60 billion a year. Well, if people were naturally greedy, why would you have to tell them this Coke is the real thing and all this BS? I don't believe that people are naturally greedy, but we've got used to thinking this is, teenage girls in the United States, their greatest recreation is shopping. Mm-hmm. That's a recreation? But we don't have nature to go out in, and I guess we just want to see what's the latest thing Walmart's offering us. I don't know, but we've come to assume that that's a part of who we are, and it's not. But when I was a kid, this is back in the 1940s, of course, we never went out to a restaurant, and I can remember Mom and Dad going out to a restaurant, which is a big deal. Kids didn't go to the restaurant. Because going to a restaurant was a big deal. Most people now, or at least a lot of people, spend a huge amount of time getting their nutrition in restaurants. Yeah. That's not the way that we live. And we need big changes. But, if I don't want to leave before I say the problem with capitalism, with our economic system now is it's built on exploitation of nature, but nature isn't the foundation on which the economy is based. I mean, the reality is, without nature, you don't have an economy, but nature should be the foundation on which we then build an economy, but it's not. But the other thing is the drive for maximizing profit without any question of, are there no limits? Why would the richest person in the world want to have more and want to have fewer and fewer laws regulating how much they've got? I mean, these multi-billionaires have more than they and their extended family could spend in 100 lifetimes, and yet they want more. Why is that even legal?
It's so funny because on our podcast, we're always talking about scientific subjects, but we always end being like, fuck, it's capitalism. Fuck, it's these rich. It's so interesting how all the issues actually really do come back to that in a really clear way, which can be so frustrating because political will, you would assume, would somehow stop this from happening, but it doesn't seem to be happening. But it is really interesting you saying that because I think it's a huge part of the problem. Even the advertising industry, as people who work on YouTube, I think a huge issue with what has happened with these huge tech companies is just that the advertisers came in, took over all that could have been good about the internet and fucked the internet. It's so interesting how advertising is so nefarious in so many ways, including the climate crisis, because it goes back to what you said. And all of this is just to sell people things on a lie that continues the degradation of our planet. It's just interesting how it always seems to come back to capitalism, advertising,
even,
and billionaires.
Yeah.
within like greenwashing and like buying products that are good for the environment or buying reuse, like a lot of it, even when you're telling someone how to be a good environmentalist, a lot of companies are saying buy this stuff instead of that stuff.
Well, it's interesting now that the oil companies want us to believe that there's nothing we can do. They want us to give up so that we stop bugging them and they can just go on and keep making all that money. It's the damnedest thing. We boast that we are rational animals. We're not rational animals at all. We're rationalizers. We act and do all kinds of things, and then we justify it by saying, oh, what I really meant was this, or what I really wanted was this. Like, we're not rational at all, the rationality. And this is something the questions you sent me are really intriguing and interesting, but one of the most important ones was, look, why haven't we been more effective than we have? When we started our foundation, the issue of the environment was at the top of the agenda. People were very concerned about it, and we said at that time, we're starting the turnaround decade. I gathered a group of people together to say, look, is there already one organization, Greenpeace, Western Canada Wilderness, WWF, is there an organization we should all put our weight behind to get us changing direction? Or do we need yet another organization? And we met for 3 days, and after a day, it was clear that most environmental groups spring up because there's a problem. Mrs. Smith says they're going to spray chemicals on the kids' schoolyard, so let's stop that. Or they're flooding this, they're going to build a dam here, or they're going to clear cut this forest. Organizations spring up because there's a crisis. But the underlying root causes of our destruction are not addressed. And we keep fighting over and over again. Dams that we fought and stopped in the 1970s are now being built or already built. So what the hell's going on? And so we said we're going to look at the root cause of our destructiveness. And it's crystal clear that when you do that, then we have fundamentally shifted from what humans knew for 99.9% of our existence, that we are animals. We've understood that we are one strand in a web of relationships or nature, that we are based on air, water, soil, energy from the sun, and the diverse plants and animals. That's the way we've always understood. And when you live in a web, what you do shakes the entire web. And so there's reciprocity in what you do in that web. But what I believe that what happened, if you can bear with me, I think that the real shift then happened with the Renaissance. I have to go back even further now.
No, that's interesting. Yeah.
Since you're a science program, all of the evidence, if we trace back through the web of connection, all of the evidence is we originated in Africa 200,000 years ago. That's crystal clear. And why don't you interview the Ku Klux Klan? You're a science program. You can tell them. We're all Africans. What the hell's your problem?
Seriously.
So, we stayed in the Serengeti in the savannas for about 100,000 years. Then we began to move. And we don't know why. Probably there were enough people to have tribal wars or ran out of certain things. I personally think it was teenagers looking for action on another side of a mountain. We bred with Neanderthals, right? So
yeah, of course.
And they weren't as smart as we were. So yeah. Anyway, whatever the reason, we began to move. Wherever we moved, we were an invasive species. We didn't know how things worked here. Oh wow, they're a bird. They don't have any wings. They're yummy to eat. You can follow as we moved across the planet a wave of extinction of the big, slow-moving animals. So even with a spear and a stone axe, we were a very deadly predator. But so we moved into new areas as an invasive species. But then people had to say, hey, damn it, there aren't any birds left, or there aren't any of these plants. They had to learn to live in a different way. And they did that by saying, oh, we really screwed up there. We just shouldn't have done that. Or, wow, that really worked. That became the accumulated knowledge of the indigenous peoples. So we established as we moved then people who were staying, whose lives were built on the mistakes and successes of their ancestors. So that's basically, and we spread, one group spread from Africa to Europe. Now, Europe was not nearly as abundant and prolific as you got in the tropical areas. I mean, it was cold. We didn't have any fur. You had to worry about keeping warm at night. You had to find shelter. So the ones that went up there had to be more inventive about how you use your environment. Now, the problem is there isn't as much sunlight up there. It's cooler up there, right? Well, you and I, we all need vitamin D. How is vitamin D made? Vitamin D, when ultraviolet B penetrates the skin, it takes a cholesterol precursor, converts it to vitamin D3, and vitamin D3 is transferred to the liver and the kidneys and converted into vitamin D. But the important thing is ultraviolet B has got to get there to start the whole process. That's why vitamin D is the sunshine vitamin, right? Well, up in the temperate areas, you don't get as much sun. So guess what? There's selection then for less pigment in the skin. So what you get then is selection for you two sitting there are just two mutants. That's all you are. You know, it's the same thing as me. You see my eyes. These eyelids are filled with fat. And with a very small slit then, it means that my eyeball is kept warm in cold climates. So I'm a mutant too. My ancestors were selected to protect my eyeballs. So white skin then became a selective. It is not a mark of superiority. It just means that you allow more ultraviolet light to penetrate your skin to make the vitamin D that you need. Anyway, that's an interesting sidelight.
Yeah, so interesting.
The Renaissance starts in the 1400s, and you get what is his name? Michelangelo and all these artists bring up, but you get Rene Descartes, who said "Cogito ergo sum." You guys all speak Latin, so you know what that.
I'm trying to learn Spanish.
I think
not Latin.
I think, therefore I am. And Francis Bacon said, "Scientia," science or knowledge, "scientia potestas est." Knowledge is power, and that's the beginning that we are different because of our brains,
Intelligence, yeah.
and that brain gives us knowledge, scientia, that is power to control our surroundings. So that begins a real change. And Isaac Newton then says, oh my God, we can actually map the movement of the sun and the moon and the star. We can map that. So the whole universe behaves like an immense clockwork mechanism. He saw the universe as a mechanical thing. And we can study that by looking at the parts. We'll look at the momentum or the movement of the moon around the sun and figure things out. And we can get the mass of the body. And if we look at enough parts of this mechanical entity, we can put it all back together and explain everything. So that was the reductionist idea. Focus on parts with the idea that we'll understand the whole eventually. Now, we now know today that it doesn't work that way. We saw through Heisenberg's work that at the most elementary level, if you're trying to measure an electron and a proton, or say you're trying to measure an electron, you can measure the mass or the momentum, the velocity. So you can, but you can't measure both at one time.
Both, yeah.
You have to hold one constant. So there is uncertainty, even at the most elementary level. There's no absolute certainty. How can you construct anything by looking, and then there's uncertainty right from the beginning? There, you can't be. And then what the Nobel Prize winner, Roger Sperry, studying the split brain, he showed that, our brains are divided into different functions, right? They're not the same. Mm-hmm. But when you cut the brain, they cut the corpus callosum, the big band of nerves that joins the two hemispheres, you create these two separate people. If you study each of the parts separately and add up what you learn from that, they don't explain what happens when they're connected together, because there are what Roger Sperry calls emergent properties. Mm-hmm. New properties arise by the combination. So you can't predict. And yet most of biology today is running on a reductionist idea. Yeah. That you focus on parts to understand the whole. Just doesn't work that way.
It's so interesting because your literature, like your books, like they're incredible feats of science communication. And I think what is so interesting about you, and what I wanted to ask earlier, was like, and we talk about this a lot, within the realm of people interested in what we do, who love science, who respect science. We're in a psychotic time right now where science is being questioned, but within that realm, you can find division. People who really believe science is truth, science is quote unquote always good, science is right. But what's so interesting about you is you have this amazing way of explaining science, explaining how things work. You work in such incredible indigenous knowledge, and you really can tear down science in its flaws, which I think is so important and so rare. And so I'm so curious, like, where did you start doing that? And do you find the scientific community to be frustrating to work within sometimes, while also having to fight this larger battle, what's happening in America, for example, with anti-vaccination concepts and just like the denial of the climate crisis? I find ourselves struggling that line. And whenever I read and hear you speak, it makes me feel so seen. And I'm just like, where did you get the ability to communicate science while questioning
one of the things that my dad taught me from a young age is the problem with Japanese people in Canada is we're very reluctant to get up. The Japanese tradition is not to stand out from others. You know, the thing, if a nail sticks out of the ground, you pound it down. And so Japanese tend to be very shy, and they stutter a lot. And my dad said, if you want to succeed in Canada, you have to be able to get up and speak. So he made me enter public speaking contests. I don't know if they still have them. And then he trained me how to be a public speaker. When I'd have to memorize and give the speech, and he would train me. That was very, very important for me. And I found in college that I had an ability. I went to a very fine liberal arts college in the States, and one of the things that we had to do in our sophomore year was take a course in public speaking. And we had to give 6 talks in our classes, and each one would be critiqued. It was a really interesting exercise. And of course, by then I found that I really had an ability. And a lot of it was for my dad. When I started doing television, my father was an avid, like he was so proud of the work, and he watched. But if I called him up, he'd say, David, you know I love you. I love the work you're doing. But I couldn't understand what you were trying to say. If I who love you and admire your work can't understand, you better do better. You're not doing so he'd give me shit. And so I always think that my dad never went to university. I always think of my dad when I'm talking. If dad doesn't get it, I'm going to be in deep trouble. So, but when I graduated, I got my PhD and a postdoc in the United States. And I came back to Canada. I deliberately left. I had all kinds of offers from the United States, but I left. I had to get out of the United States because anyway, that's a whole nother story. But I deliberately left and came back. But I was a hotshot geneticist. You know, I'd had a terrific education. had a great postdoc in one of the top labs in the world, and I was ready to conquer the world. So I'm just starting in setting up my own research. I'm a geneticist, going to study fruit flies. When a woman comes along and just completely sidetracked me, story of my life since puberty, I guess. But my great sadness is I never met her. But in 1962, Rachel Carson published a book called Silent Spring.
Wow.
And it was all about the
Spring.
Silent Spring, all about the unexpected effects of pesticides. Now you have to remember, when pesticides were found to kill insects, and this was work by, what was his name? Paul Mueller. He won a Nobel Prize in 1948 for showing that DDT kills arthropods, including insects. And people thought, oh, that's great. You know, we can now get rid of mosquitoes that spread malaria. We can control pests that destroy our crops. And we began to use DDT. Like everybody thought, this is it. What a great invention. Nobody said, hey, wait a minute now. The most important group of animals on the planet are insects. They're the most abundant, diverse group of animals. You know, if every human being went extinct tomorrow, nature would rebound and green up very quickly. If all insects disappeared, and we've been declaring war on insects ever since Paul Mueller, terrestrial ecosystems around the planet would collapse because insects are a vital component of that. But we went ahead and used DDT like mad. It made no sense to spray a chemical that kills all insects just to get at the one or two that were pests to human beings. I mean, that's crazy. But we went ahead anyway. And then years later, he had won the Nobel Prize, bird watchers began to say, what the hell's happening? The birds are disappearing, especially the raptors, eagles, hawks. And scientists tracked it down and discovered something they didn't know anything about, called biomagnification. You spray in parts per million, they're eaten, that microorganisms absorb it, they concentrate it, they're eaten by bigger organisms, and at each level up the food chain, you concentrate it. So by the time you get to the shell glands of birds or the breasts of women, you've concentrated DDT tens of thousands of times. So this is a phenomenon we only discovered as a biological reality when eagles began to disappear. Wow. So that's when I said, what the hell? No amount of testing beforehand could have told us about biomagnification. You know, you can do controlled experiments and all that. But when you study in a Florence flask, you put a plant and an insect and spray it, or if you study it in a growth chamber, or even in a controlled field, what does that tell you? It's a limited study. It snows, it rains, the wind blows. You can't tell where that DDT is going to end up, in rivers and lakes, because science now is reductionist. We're always
so
just focusing.
Specific.
And we think a controlled situation, that's not a replica or an example of nature. It's an artifact. It's a creation. Science has to look and you gain a great deal of understanding of that one little system. But out in the real world, you have no idea. You know, one of the craziest things we're doing right now are neonicotinoids. You know, these are powerful insecticides that they're putting seeds in the insecticide, and when they plant the seed, every part of the plant has neonicotinoids. The roots, the stem, everything you eat in that plant has got neonicotinoids. And we began to fight against it because honeybees were 4 times more sensitive than other insects to this. So everybody's saying, but wait a minute now. I say, how does DDT or the neonicotinoids, how do they kill insects? Well, guess what? They are very powerful neurotoxins. They kill by affecting the nerves of insects. Wait a minute now. I got a huge government grant because I was studying a nerve mutant in fruit flies, because fruit fly nerves are the same as nerves. And wait a minute now. We're saying that neonicotinoid plants are going to be in the leaves or the roots that we're eating, and they affect nerves, and we're blaming vaccination for autism? Like, what the hell? Right? This is crazy.
Wow. Yeah. That was such a good way of explaining it. Like, literally. And it is so interesting. Like, I think it is important to really go back in the time frame and history of science the way you kind of just did. Like the quote unquote enlightenment, all these things, like, it's not that long ago. It's so easy to forget. It's so important to understand as science communicators that the scientific process is so recent and so flawed for that reason. It is so reductionist, materialism, all these things. It's so specific. It's so important to remember, while also communicating
very
properly.
Important. Climatologists are telling us they can't predict.
Then also back to that,
yeah, they can't predict. So the problem is this: if you did an autopsy of 1,000 people the bodies have come from all over the world, where you only look at the brains, the neurons, and the sense organs of 1,000 bodies, you will not be able to say, this is a female, this is a male. You will not be able to say, these are black people, these are Asians, these are Europeans. Why? We're all from one species. We're built on the same basic plan. There may be variants, there may be mutations that make you guys white and me darker, but basically we're all of our sense organs are detecting the same thing, right? And yet, eyewitness reports are notoriously bad. You could say, I saw this thing, but what you see is very different. Why? Because even though all of our instruments for detecting the world are the same, gender difference, ethnicity difference, geochemical, cultural differences, language, religion, all of these things affect the way that we see the world. So then the question is, how the hell are we ever going to come to agreement? That's why the COP meetings, you can't do anything at the COP meetings, because we're all looking at the issue through different lenses and see priorities in a different way. But the one thing where everybody has to agree is science. Science is not perfect. Can't give you the big picture. But science is a way of looking at the world. And everybody agrees. Yes, okay, that's a good technique. That's a good control. Yeah, okay. Doesn't mean we're always right, because, when we began to say, hey, maybe we should have women in psychology. Maybe there should be black people looking in this area. And guess what? You get a different result. But the thing about science is it's ultimately self-correcting. People try to repeat what you've done. They try to show that this is right. And in the process, your observations become better and better. And that's the way we are with climate right now. We don't know. We can't tell what the hell's going to happen. But they can say there are some fundamental things everybody agrees on. That is, there are certain molecules that will trap heat on this planet. Greenhouse gases will trap heat. The more of those you have, the warmer it's going to get. What the ultimate repercussions will be, we don't know. But it is upsetting the balance, the equilibrium that we've had for 10,000 years during the Holocene period. So science then at least gives you a kind of basis on which that we can all then decide about the economic, political, legal implications. But let's use what scientists are telling us about the world as the basis for our conversation. That's why the world scientists' warning to humanity in 1992, signed by 1,500 scientists from 71 countries in the world, including over half of all Nobel Prize winners. And that's, you got to do a whole show on the world scientist warning. I don't know if you've done that. But
No,
that
we
was the
should. This is
statement that said
1992.
we're in
Wow.
deep trouble. It said human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. And they outlined everything there. 25 years later, 16,000 scientists from 184 countries released a world scientist warning to humanity, a second notice, saying things are worse. And 5 years after that, they published World Scientist Warning, the science crisis, the climate crisis 2023. And the first line is, human beings and climate are the problem with climate today is we are in code red for the future of human beings. So the science, the important thing is, the first warning came in 1992, signed by 71 countries. The second one, signed by 16,000 scientists, had 184 countries represented, because science is the one thing that gives us information we can all agree on.
I mean,
Now,
I think
how we apply that science has to be done in a bigger context. It can't just be to make money, and it can't be just to save human beings at the expense of the rest of nature. So we need the guidance of the values of indigenous people who've lived in place for thousands of years to guide the way that we interpret and use the science. Now, I've gone way over the time I was supposed to.
No, this has
I'm
been
sorry.
so incredible.
No, and an amazing note to sort of wrap up on.
Yes.
Obviously, we have a great respect and appreciation for scientists all over the world, for science communicators, for environmentalists, and exactly as you said, it's not always perfect, but it's kind of like the best system we have now. My sort of hope lies in, as you said, even when humans went out of Africa and had to learn new spaces, it takes time to kind of like adjust, and hopefully we are still in this period, despite it feeling like it's taking forever. Maybe on the grander scale, humans can look back in a few hundred years and say, okay, eventually they sort of realized it. But as we said earlier, like, hope is nothing without action. So thank you so much
Thank you
for
so
spending
much.
your time with us today. It's been a huge privilege and a pleasure to chat to you. And we're super grateful for your work and
And your
hope
time.
to